Good afternoon. Thank you, Frantz. I'd like to thank everyone who had a hand in having me here, especially Frantz Grenet and the colleagues. Delphine, thank you for the water, really, every time. Many of you have not been to all the talks, except a few, of course. These 4 talks revolved around how did the memory of something, the idea of Iran, come to the Sasanians in late antiquity. And in the first lecture, we looked at the Sistani connection from the east and what could have seeped into the province of Fars, which goes to lecture 2, which these Sasanians, they may be from the east or not, co-opted that tradition and then connected, of course, to the local Persian tradition of Fars. They sought an ancestor that may have gone back only a few generations or 100 years or 2 to the local dynasties of Fars, and combining that with the Sistani Avestan tradition. In the third lecture, I spoke about geography. Now that there's this heritage, how do these Sasanians visualize, see themselves as to where they are? How do they adopt and co-opt Avestan notions of geography and the realia of late antique world? How do you do that? How do you make the map? And then who becomes an Iranian? This is a map, how do you protect it? And what is the notion of Iran? And we said I think there's a turn from ethnos and religion to something more, and it's more culture. It's not being Iranian, but rather doing Iranian. And I give you examples of mannerism, foodways was an important one, the way you eat, what you eat, as well as what games you play, your notions. All of this becomes the center of the idea of Iran at the end of late antiquity. Today, in the last lecture, I would like to discuss how these Sasanians looked at their neighbors. Not all of them, but to the east and west. And how in classical studies, the relations between the Sasanians and the Romans have been perceived, and how we may perceive it within the Iranian studies or from the lens of this Avestan Iranian tradition. I would apologize to many of the Iranians and those who work on Iran because this would be already known. But I think it works in a special way to define why the Iranians do what they do. And this is not only in the 6th, 7th century, I think it's even earlier. So the vision of the world in late antique Erānšahr. In the 7th century, Khusro Parviz, known as Khusro II, where you see his special issued silver drap, took the conquest of the Near East with the aid of his 2 great generals, Shaheen and Shahbaz. With blazing speed, the Sasanian forces got to Damascus. Palestine and the Holy Land were taken in 614, which sent really shock waves to Constantinople as the Holy Land had been conquered. Egypt was then conquered. It's a matter of controversy how the Persians entered Egypt, but most probably through Alexandria. And they were able to stay there for until 619 to 628. I think that's the dates. Anatolia was taken, and even the city of Constantinople was put under siege. This was not a normal Sasanian Roman conflict. Most of the conflict had been taken on the boundary between the Sasanian Empire and the Roman world. For this fact, the great scholar of late antique history with special knowledge in war, James Howard Johnston, in many studies, including this last book, The Last Great War of Antiquity, suggests that this undertaking by the Sasanians destroyed this binary order of the late antique world. So in his mind, there's a binary. There are two forces, the Romans and the Persians. And this war upset that balance. This idea that Rome and Iran were the two great powers come through classical sources, although put within the mouth of Khosrow, where the world is imagined as the two eyes of the earth. And of course, this is the title of my colleague, Matthew Canepa, a brilliant scholar who deals with art history and history, of looking at the world as the two eyes, one Rome and one Iran, or the Sasanians. This is what, at least in the Western tradition and in terms of Byzantine historians, that is what is put out. This destruction of the late antique world order brought major changes. And Glenn Bowersock, in a brilliant set of lectures, Empires in Collision in Late Antiquity, suggests that, both sides are at fault, and there are reasons why these wars take place. But Emperor Heraclius' victory and the emptying out of the Near East of Sasanian forces created a vacuum in which the Arab Muslims were easily allowed to come and fill in the gap or the empty void. He calls this in a chapter, Gift of Heraclius. So in a sense, it is suggested that Heraclius was not able to manage this exchange with the Sasanians, and it opened up the Near East to them. Of course, by 627, 628, Khosrow II, although his forces were defeated, he was actually killed through a coup, either with his son and General Shahrvaraz, who had a major hand. And that in itself is a major, I think, topic that needs to be talked about. I think Shahrvaraz is the single most important actor in 7th century late antique Iran, which has not gotten the credit it deserves. So, if the Holy Land is taken, and the true cross and the Holy Grail, as the sort of tradition has it, has been taken, what do you do? We know through, again, Byzantine sources, and not always at the same time, but about later, but also from the time of Heraclius, that there is a very thick amount of Christian ideology at work with Heraclius's campaign against the Persians. We are told that Heraclius, on the march to fight the Persians, promises his troops eternal life. Khosrow II is seen as the destroyer of the world, in a sense, this binary idea of upsetting, but more in a Christian terminology. And so, not only that, the coins of Heraclius, there is special hemidrach minting of coins by Heraclius where church silver and gold are actually melted, and these coins are minted to pay the troops to fight the Persians. And it says, I think, God help the Romans. So it has a very clear, I think, sense of crusade-like, and I'm going to talk about this, tone to it. Yuri Stoyanov, in a short but I think really brilliant work, Defenders and Enemies of the True Cross, has discussed it and whether this is the first crusade that we're talking about in world history before the Muslims come or not. But that is the Byzantine view of things. That is what comes out in our Byzantine sources. To continue on this, we should ask, why did Khosrow suddenly upset this balance? Why did he move so vehemently against the Byzantines? The conventional reasoning for this is that Emperor Maurice, who had supported Khosrow II during his time of trouble when he came to throne, had been murdered in Byzantium. And Maurice's son, Theodosius, had taken refuge in Erānšahr. And this was because Phocas, the new emperor, had usurped the throne and killed the rightful ruler. So now, this was the casus belli, this is the reason now, to return the rightful heir, that is Theodosius, back to the throne. That is the son. Now, we see Theodosius in sources is discussed as a reason that he should be brought. But as the war progresses, he becomes less and less important and even known in the sources. It's really interesting. If you want to bring him back, but as the war progresses, he is actually left aside. So I am not exactly sure this is the main reason for Khosrow's actions. And so we should talk about the idea of the cross and the grail, which by 614 are taken from Jerusalem, as we're told according to Byzantine sources, and taken to Iran. I don't think there's a clear notion of where it may have been or it's been taken. Of course, Shiz, the sacred fire temple in northwestern Iran, is where some sources mention, all the way to the medieval, I think, German Christian tradition suggests that the grail actually is at the bottom of this pitless lake at Shiz. So there are medieval tales about that. The grail actually is there. We know better of the cross. So why did Khosrow take this? Again, if we follow this Byzantine notion that this is a crusade, it's clear that these pagan Iranians have gone and taken our cross. We should know that as early as 593, Khosrow II had made dedications to Saint Sergius, an important saint who had been martyred in the 4th century, I think, or 4th or 5th, and had made a vow that he would actually dedicate more things to the shrine of Saint Sergius, a Christian martyr, if he would be victorious. That is now something to ask. Then what would he go at the sort of this border of the two empires and dedicate to a Christian shrine? And we should also know that Khosrow's favorite wife, who probably is Shirin, was a Christian. And Christianity had made inroads into this empire. I wonder, and I'm not the first one to say this, but I wonder if in fact this Persian crusade is of another nature. That is, if there is a Christian church in the 5th century established in Persia, Church of the East, might it not be that you bring the cross to your favorite wife and the Christian community, and as a universal king, and I talked about universalism, the aspiration of the Chinese and the Romans and the Sasanians to have the cross there as prestige. So it's not a war against Christianity, but rather making Erānšahr a center, another weight added to this complex interrelations of Zoroastrians and Christians and others within the empire. I think it makes sense to appease and bring prestige and allow Christians to further be attached to this imperial notion of a universal empire of Erānšahr, where law is most important. So that is my counter to what is generally being put out. Now, that does not mean that the Sasanians aren't interested in war. They don't see war in a special coloring. The term ardik has been discussed by Jamshid Chokshi about, in fact, if you go through Zoroastrian literature, there is religious causes where war take place. And I've just picked one term that I'm really interested in is from Dr. Azar Nusha's really important article, which I've suggested this should be a book, with commentaries where sacrificing yourself, but sacrificing for what? Is it for your religion or is it for Erānšahr? Is something that is and could be done. And is this a reference to some sort of a holy battle or fighting for something that is holy? And that is something I think that needs to be discussed within the context of this chapter of Dinkat 8. Looking at it from the Sasanian worldview, if we have a holy war, the war is usually used as a tool to fight injustice. And in this Zoroastrian world, those who create chaos, which brings injustice, should be defeated, so there is order and justice. So this binary idea for the Zoroastrians is quite clear. It's interesting that Bo'utas, and it's not but Bo'utas, in an important article called Jango Ashti, War and Peace in Iran, has gone through Persian, Arabic, and Middle Persian literature and comes to the idea that for these Zoroastrian Sasanians or Iranians, war and treaty seems to be of main concern, and less of war and peace, something that we would see on the other side. And that, I think, has an important notion into what I would like to talk about. That is, you don't want to necessarily make peace, but you make treaty, and then you fight. You make treaty, and you fight. In this context, let us revisit briefly the wars between the Persians and the Romans in the 3rd and the 4th century, where Ardashir I began to face Alexander Severus. Nisipus and Karhe in the Near East was taken by the Persians. And again, there's divergent ideas as why the Sasanians would do this. Roman sources basically say these are predatory activity. The Persians, such as Ardashir and Shapur, are going there because they just want to plunder. Of course, we should remember, as in the first lecture I mentioned, the Romans had steadily created provinces and were moving on to Mesopotamia. And if you're just looking at it at realpolitik, if you were sitting in Ctesiphon or close by, you would say, what are the Romans doing in Mesopotamia? And so they're being pushed back. But I think there's further reasons, and I've talked about this before, that the Sasanians eventually changed the economic structure of the late ancient world. You destroy the cities of Dura Europus, Hatra, and Palmyra, where the caravan trade came to the Persian Gulf and went to Bahrain, Oman, and India in the Parthian period, where Kharax became a hub. You do not want these entities all to have a free hand in the trade. What the Sasanians do is to bring down the old cities, establish new cities, especially on the side of the Persian Gulf, although they encircle the entire Persian Gulf. And they are going to control the economy by the empire or by the imperial order. There is a change. And this attack of Ardashir and Shapur is not predatory. It's to change the economic sort of balance that existed in the late ancient world. Again, in the 4th century, when Shapur is fighting Constantius and eventually Julian, who we talked about, Julian the Apostate as he's known, and Jovian, again, we hear of treaties where territories are given back to the Persians, including the city of Nisibis, but Armenia. But in these correspondences, according to the Romans, these Persians are saying our ancestors. Well, in Middle Persian, in the second lecture, I talked about Ahinagan, owned this area, and it belongs to us. But who are these Ahinag? Who are the ancestors of these Sasanians that the Sasanians are making these claims against the Romans? Is it the Achaemenids or someone else? So in the discussion, there's a lot of police outside today. Shapur's discussion about his forefathers is interesting. It's vague at best, telling the Romans that we own these territories by ancestral right, that our forefathers, which I would take as Middle Persian Ahinag, owned this place. So who are the Ahinags? Who is he talking about? For the Romans, it's quite clear. These are the Achaemenid Persians. Of course, the Persians were there before. And so the Romans have no doubt that that is what the Persians are saying. But is that what they are saying? Is that what they're looking at? this talk should be dedicated to someone that I really enjoyed learning from him, Sir Fergus Millar at Oxford. Really a great historian of the Near East, a Romanist, but a Near Eastern historian. And we talked about this matter, actually, quite a lot. And in his work, he has repeated and told me that, in general, the Sasanians never were interested to go beyond the Euphrates, west of Euphrates. That was the traditional boundary. And so this now upsetting of the 7th century begs the question, why? Why? Let's see, if the Sasanians were interested at a just war, whatever that may be, what would be the justifications beside bringing back the son of the Emperor Morris who's been killed? Can Khusro tell us or show us anything from the material culture about what he wants to do? Before I say this, let me say again, bring us back to our first lecture and second, and Avesta as a source of ideology in late antiquity. Jean Kellens has, in several studies, shown that the Avesta, as we think of it as a collection of sacred hymns and how it's been grafted together and so on, all in all, when it's written down, it's a text of late antique production. If the evidence based on the orthography and other suggestions suggests a 4th century CE, it is quite interesting. That is exactly during the time of Shapur II, where these discussions are being made about ancestors and so on. Avesta is already in some form there, and probably a Zand to it, although I think Professor Panaino has an idea that it's much earlier. In fact, there was an Avestan text already in the Parthian times, if I'm not mistaken. So the really heroic, epic parts of the Avesta Airiiaēča are very important in the outline of Iranian history. All those who have read the Zamyad Yash, the Kayānīd Yash 19, or other parts of the Yash, and you put that along with the Shahnameh, and you look at the intermediary Middle Persian, you see a continuity. Although I would say that this, you may be looking at a dual function or a Dumizilian tri-functional. That is, the Zoroastrian texts give the Zoroastrian nature, the Persian epic gives the kingly nature, and then of course we have oral stories and traditions, which I would say is the 3rd function. But that's the way in my mind how this would work. But all in all, the progression of history is similar to each other. And so if the 4th century you have the Avesta and it's making an impact on the Iranian worldview, the Khodai Namak, the 6th century Sasanian national history or royal history, which Agathias tells us, as he had a friend in the archives at Ctesiphon, but also Sebius, Armenian historian, and Xvarənah, Movses Xvarənah talks about the book, as it is said in the book of Persians. We know that there's the Avesta, there's the national or royal history of the Sasanians, and then we have some sort of a rendition of it in the Shahnameh Book of Kings in the 10th and 11th century. And it seems that the storyline are not so different, although I would stop at that. So what I think is happening is certainly Zoroastrian sacred scripture is having an impact on Sasanian historiography. As I mentioned, in late antiquity, Christians are writing their history as a sacred narrative. So in the 3rd and 4th century, you're beginning to see history not in the traditional Roman history, but the Bible becomes an important beginning. As I would say now for this Iranian tradition, the beginning is looked at as a sacred text from the Avestan tradition. So if that is the case, and it seems like it at least, that the Pishtadians and the Kayānīds, the early sort of dynasties as they appear, not in some organized way really through the Avesta, and the Sasanians become the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd tier of major stories and histories that are discussed in these texts. And you begin to see this interconnectedness of these dynastic traditions and the interconnectedness of Iranian history from the first man till the coming of the Savior and the end of time. Or at least as when there's the composition is sort of withered away. There's no more. When we look at the Avesta in a cursory manner, we find a number of people, 5 and 3 most importantly, where the Iranians, the Turanians, or Aryans and the Turanians and the Sarimans are mentioned, and their Fravashis, their guardian spirits, are all worshipped. We worship the Fravashi of the righteous men in the Aryan countries. Aryanam, Dahyunam, Naram, Ashnanam, Fravashi, Yazamaide, and the Yazamaide, and Yazamaide, and Yazamaide. These 3 people in the Avesta are going to be turned into the realia of the political order of late antiquity. Now, of course, I had really worked on this and wanted to present it as something very new until Professor Grenet just a couple of days ago handed me his articles on Turan, and basically most of it was there. So I can't really say that this is my real idea or something very new. But in this Iranian worldview, there is a tripartite division of the world. I would say contrary to the Roman-Byzantine bipartite, the 2 eyes of the earth, the Iranian tradition has really a much wider and a larger outlook. And as a central empire, if you remember my lecture on geography, where xvarənah, the central climb, which is double the size of the rest of them, becomes Erānšahr. And everybody else is revolving around them. If you remember, there were Romans, Slavs, there were others moving around that are there. We see that at 3, that is Iran, is associated with this personage Iraj, which, by the way, was my father's name, Tūr, which is Avestan Tūra and gives us Middle Persian Tūč or Tūrč, which is my name, Touraj. And then there's a third, Salm, which the Bundeshan mentioned, Sarm de hast Rome, the land of Salm is Rome. So clearly, the Middle Persian commentators who know the Avesta are saying, okay, the Salm, that's where the Romans are. And Iraj, okay, that's where the Iranians are. And Tūr, that's where the Turanians are. Now, who the Turanians are and so on, you have to look to the east and to the west of you to figure out what's going on. And I think this is the impact of Avestan, what I would call nativist history, on the tripartite vision of the world, and not a bipart tradition, where at the beginning you have unity, initially during the Pishtats. You have one world, one ruler, and you, of course, this is a well-known story of the division by King Frēdōn in Persian tradition of the land of the world between his three sons, Salm, Iraj, Tūrč, which gives us, of course, Rome, Iran, Turan, and so the Romans and the Iranians and the Turanians come about. This is not so dissimilar in terms of imagination of what the Greeks think of ethnos and how they create some sort of a genealogy. And the Greeks also make that connection of all sort of races as such to one another, including the Persians and the Medes. So here I think we begin to see the impact of history and epic in late antiquity. The imposition and grafting of Avestan tradition onto history and geography. These Persian kings or rulers of the Sasanians are living in late antiquity, but they still act as Indo-European, sort of Indo-Iranian heroes. They're playing a part in that. Dragon slaying is still being discussed. Not only Ardashir, and I take the Kerm, Frantz, and you can help me with that. The Kerm, a warm snake dragon, basically the same, if you think about it in the Karnameh Ardeshir Babakan, here's the scene of Bahram, actually it's the fifth, it's not the fourth, slaying of dragon. So these kings, in order to show their prowess and their rightful kingship, you have to do the dragon slaying. That's a typical feature of an Indo-European hero. Ruler. And so we can see that these stories are being played out even in this cycle of history. And the kings are playing a part in this great cycle as it's taking place. How about topography? If that is the case, so the earth becomes sacred, or what the Iranians are ruling over. So again, the imposition of Avestan sacred topography onto the Iranian plateau. Ray of the Avesta, which seems to have been to the east, perhaps Afghanistan, becomes the birthplace of Zoroaster. Azerbaijan, of course, has a sacred fire temple, so you peg a sacred temple to it. Persepolis Parsa becomes Yima's throne, again, imposition of Avestan onto the tradition. And Sistan becomes where the career of Zoroaster takes place. And so I would, of course, suggest, and this is a term I've made up, that the Ahinak, the ancestors of these Iranians, and what they claim, if they're claiming against the Romans, are not the Achaemenids, but what I call the Frēdōnites. These people are interested in a totally different world. As the Avesta has impacted their historiography, their vision of who their ancestors are, and if we follow our second lecture, that their memory of the Achaemenids is quite vague, and it's only the local dynasts of the Fars. When Herodian, important historian, tells us that Shapur II was trying to take back the Near East through his ancestral rites, I would contend it's not the Achaemenid Persians that they're trying to redo, but actually looking back to their own historical tradition, the Frēdōnites, where at some times there was some unity and rulership by one. This is quite important because now, as Ian Gardner, Jason Bedun, and Paul Dilly in their Mani at the court of the Persian kings, and the two subsequent volumes, and through the kindness of Jason Bedun, which I should thank, it's clear that in the 4th century, the Sasanians are quite knowledgeable of Khosrow. They know about Zarathustra, and there are actually discussions of these characters. This is not a post-Hunnic, post-Kidarite, or going back post-Alkhona, I'm going from the forward to the back, event that causes this impact, as has been said. If this Chester Beatty Kefalaya of Mani is a 4th century, and these names are there, it's already there. And that's why I'm pushing this Frēdōnite ideology already from the beginning, and not a transformation at the middle of it because of the coming of the Eastern nomadic forces. So in the 7th century, if we take this, what I call Persianate or Sasanian ideological framework of history, this holy war, if it's a holy war, should show itself in some form, some text. If I'm making this, I should make it either up or show some evidence to that. So let's look at the numismatic evidence, as I do through every time, and then let's look at the textual evidence for perhaps a deeper but a later understanding of what these Sasanians are thinking of the world, rather than what the Romans are telling what the Sasanians are thinking. Khosrow II, who ruled from 590 to 628 CE, has 3 different distinct coinage type, which perhaps for the numismatist is quite interesting. I think for most historians, okay, you have the 8990, and then 10 years after you have another change of numismatics. And as he's becoming successful against the Romans, we begin to see the fully developed coinage of Khosrow. And these coins with the special, which I read it as actually sort of a shortening for abad or eternal, but it's called afid in numismatic parlance. We see that the king has the legend of increasing glory, and again is taking back taking us back to the Avestan tradition of xvarənah having glory. So they're again using this, and it's been suggested that the two rings around demonstrates or shows this increase in glory, as well as the triple in the back. His crown is connected with probably something from the Vahram Yasht, where the Vahram's wings represents offensive victory, Avestan xvarənah. And of course in the back you have the sacred fire. So you have sort of very much signs of what Zoroastrian Avestan tradition is there on the coinage. The king with his probably xvarənah. And of course these kings have the Kayānīd, that is an early part of the Avestan tradition, as being mentioned in the Yasht. Now this idea being having Kayānīd glory comes upon the rulers in this Iranian tradition. Rulers, but also heroes. In the Avesta, Khosrow, this is the Kayānīd ruler par excellence, in a way I think becomes a map or a guidebook for the Sasanian Khosrow II as he becomes more and more successful in his battles against the Romans. In the Avestan Yasht, be it Yasht 5, Avan Yasht, Yasht 10, Mehr Yasht, Yasht 19, Zamyad Yasht, it is quite clear that these heroes, these rulers, are courageous and without fear and in their battle. And that, I think, is the part that these kings begin to play a part in. And this begins certainly from Khosrow I. We may see this heroic age. Khosrow, the Kayānīd par excellence ruler, takes revenge of his father, Siavash, who had gone to Afrasiab, had been killed by the Turanians. And so the Turanians need to be avenged. This is fully, I think, now attuned to Zoroastrian historiography, where Khosrow is living and begins to act as a hero of the Persian tradition. And if we think of this, and I'm using a late, of course, image, we see the same thing happening with Heraclius. The David dish is quite well known, where in the back of it has a stamp mark of Heraclius, where David is defeating Goliath. So in this battle, as it's taking place, the Byzantine ruler Heraclius is using biblical, and I think the Iranian ruler is using the Avestan tradition, both within their own circle of ideology. Of course, these are being presented to two different people with two different traditions. The gold coinage of Khosrow II, which is a rare issue, has the title of Abi Bim Kard, Iran Abi Bim Kard, made Iran without fear. And I would suggest, of course, this is at the moment that Khosrow is at the apex of his power. He has pushed the Romans to the walls of Constantinople, and it seems that Rome is going to fall. And Turan is a more complex story. But when we look at the Middle Persian text, and I'm going back to the first text I used in The Wonders and Worthiness of Sistan, again, we read from the offsprings of Frēdōn, Salm, who ruled over the land of Rome, and Tūrč, who ruled over the land of Turkestan. So now Turkestan becomes there, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is, of course, quite a late tradition, because there are others who are there, as has been discussed by others, as you can see. So Rome, Iran, and Turan as Turkestan. And in the Book of Kings, as has been again noticed, these Turanians, when Siavash goes to Afrasiab, as we mentioned who he is, he's told in the Shahnameh that they are Turki Zaban. And this is not in our discussion with Professor Grenet, but now, of course, he has given me the information. So by this time, Turan is Turkestan. So Rome, Turkestan, and Iran. In a late Sasanian, late Middle Persian text that I would ask Professor Ardhanush to give me the reasoning that this is a post-Sasanian. I've always been wondering of this Minug Kharad. It's placed within the Middle Persian literature after I'm done. But it's interesting that, again, we find the most succinct sort of explanation, since from the pure luminous religion, it is revealed that the foundation of the malevolence of the Romans and also the Turks towards the Iranians was that kin, Persian kine, malice, which they sowed by killing Iraj until renovation, that is the end of time again, end of the world, it will continue. I suggest that within the Iranian sort of tradition, it's the sin, the kin, that has plunged the world into war. And kin, malice, is very different from a sin, a vinah, in Zoroastrian tradition. A vinah, a sin, can be expiated. It could be done away with kirbak, meritorious actions. However, a kin, malice, cannot ever be cleared. Once you have that kin and it's sown into your body, you cannot go back. So kin is sown into lineage, kin remains through lineage, and kin cannot be expiated. And here it's imagined in Shahnameh as a tree that has grown in the malice. And the story is that the Romans and the Turanians think, oh, it's going to be forgotten, and it's not. It's like a tree that it cannot be taken away. In the Dinka Act 3, again, we have another exposition of what is going on. This, also that malice is sowed in offsprings, and every sin is possible to be restored to good, because malice will remain and is present in offsprings till renovation. Again, we have this continuity till the end of time, because it is holy religion. It's clearly evident that the non-Iranians of the Romans and also of the Turks, sorry, I can't read very clearly, against the Iranians was from the beginning of that malice when they killed Iraj until renovation, end of time, will remain in offsprings. Bad translation, my perhaps mishap there, but what we see is once this kin is done, the killing of Iraj, this thing can never go back. And there will always be a war. It's not peace and war, it's treaty and war. I think Utas is correct here. And we have this continuation in the Shahnameh, which in some ways is a recension of this tradition. I'm always struck by the scholar who has just passed away recently, Dame Cameron in Oxford, who we used to correspond, and he would say, look, Touraj, and he would tell others that the Shahnameh by the 5th century becomes really interesting for history. And by the 6th century, it can be used as a historical source. And I do follow that. Here in the Shahnameh, and there are plenty of this, there's a dialogue between the Caesar and Khosrow, here, whoever that Caesar is, could be Heraclius or not, or Morris. And what we see is an inverse presentation of what Ammianus Marcellinus and Herodian has as a Roman view of things. Here we're seeing the Frēdōni sort of tradition, and you can read the English, and I'll read you the Persian. چه بگذاشت خواهی همی مرز و بوم. No, that's not the one, so I'm going to read the Shahnameh later for you. But here the Roman emperor is telling Khosrow, we will become brothers and friends. When you do not need this king, you will bring forth the malice. He says, when you don't need my help anymore, you're going to again bring this kin, and this is in Persian, from your heart. You will speak of Tūr and Salm, of the useless past events. You must make an oath with the seal, so that from now you do not speak of the malice kin of Iraj from the days of old. So as we see the Roman tradition talking about ancestors, perhaps Achaemenids, in the Iranian tradition is a wholly different view of what is going on, of what the Roman king is saying. So in, of course, late Antique and then the Middle Ages, there's the concept of brotherhoods of the kings. That we know. But again, I think this really works differently in the Iranian context versus that of the European or the Roman context. Yes, Roman emperors do call their Persian counterparts from time to time my brother. But for the Persians, this brotherhood is a wholly different affair of the Frēdōnians. That is, they look at things differently through the stories that I have actually told you, brothers at war with each other. And of course, here's a novel, a famous novel of Abbas Ma'rufi, Frēdōn سه پسر داشت, and again, it's about wars of brothers, but in a modern context. Kings as brothers. When Khosrow comes to power, he's challenged by the great general Bahram Chubin in 590-591. His father, King Hormuz, tells his son, Khosrow II, to flee to Rome and seek aid from Emperor Morris. But the way that this dialogue and this instruction is given is quite interesting. چو بگذاشت خواهی همی مرز و بوم از ایدر برو تازیان تا بروم سخنهای این بنده چاره جوی چو رفتی یکایک به قیصر بگوی به جایی که دین است و هم خواسته است سلیح و سپاه وی آراسته است فریدونیان نیز خویش تواند. So these Frēdōnians are your ancestors. چو کارت شود سخت پیش تواند. So again, in this dialogue, at least in the Shahnameh, so go to these are your relatives through Frēdōn. They will help you. But of course, this is a temporary affair. I have the translation here, sorry. If you desire to leave your land and home, then swiftly go from here to Rome. When you're gone to tell Caesar one by one the words of the remedy-seeking man in that place, there is religion and will. He is well equipped with weapons and troops. The descendants of Frēdōn, it's not lie, or in that land. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Also, they are your kinsmen. So what we have is, I think, mythical history of the past through epic becomes history for the Iranian world. And mythical thought, what Andrea Garibaldi has suggested, becomes a foundational element of Sasanian historiography. So it's no wonder that Alexander is given the title, or in this sort of sequence is brought into Rome as Horumaik, most probably through Alexander propaganda itself in the Near East, where the effect of Roman propaganda clearly manifests itself in Middle Persian text. He becomes a Horumaik. On Turan in the east, while the Turanians in the Avesta, of course, are wholly different, it is clear that the Huanites, and then the coming of the nomadic groups, the Al-Khans, the Hans, but lastly the Turks, which seem to be, of course, much later, become impactful on the psyche of Iranians and how they see these Turanians. I wonder how much of this is the acculturation of these people coming from the East to this Iranian worldview. That is, you could be Turanian, you could be an Al-Khan, you could be a Turk, but how you act and how you relate, at least on the Eastern side, it's again within this body of worldview. And I think this was discussed before and mentioned. And so some of these become descendants of Afrasiab. I think we talked about the Qarakhanids. When they wanted to say that we are Turkish nobility, they would say, oh yeah, we're descendants of Afrasiab. We're not part of this Iranian world. But who's Afrasiab? It's Frantz Grenet of the Iranian tradition. So they have to still play within this Iranian tradition to say that they are the other. And so that is, I think, quite important in this matter. And that is why I think this tradition survives into the Islamic period, especially with the Turks. I'm quite interested, and I'm going to Istanbul tomorrow to talk about Turan and the Turks, really. By the Seljuk period in 1040, we see that this wider use of what I call Sasanian Persian ideology has made this impact. And while the early dynasties of the Abbasid period claim lineage to the Sasanians, and of course we have the beginning of the birth of Persian literature, especially in the East, that has been discussed in a lecture by Professor de la Vazière, this adoption of Persianate becomes important. Either you are part of it, or even if you're against it, you have to adopt it to become against it. And of course, in Persian, statecraft and history becomes adopted wholly, as well as Shahnameh production. Lastly, I just want to end with this impact of this ideology that takes place in late antiquity all the way to what we call medieval, I guess, history of the minute. When the Seljuks of Rome, that is Anatolia, were facing the Byzantines, it's interesting when you look at onomastics, but also what they are commissioning. It seems that the rulers from 1192 to 303, if you look at their names, are Kaykhosro 1, 2, 3, Kaykavus, Kayrobad, and they are patronaging the Shahnameh. Is this a conscious effort of trying to continue the tradition against the Rum, or how much of that is part of this older tradition, or simply a matter of a kingly prestige? Thank you.